Hello everyone. So today I'm going to talk about my electrical system. Some of you have asked in the comments as to what I did with my electrical system and why. So today I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to take you end to end of everything I put in and explain the technicalities of what I did and why I did that. Okay, so let's start at the engine. Let's go over some basics first. Okay, so you can see the battery here and all the wires connected up. So let's start with alternator charging. The alternator is under there, and when the truck starts running, that turns and it feeds current to the battery. So these lines right here are connected to the alternator. And then everything else comes off of the battery coming out, which means when the engine is not running, if you have any electrical systems running in the truck, they run off of the battery and will be draining the battery. So when the engine starts, it turns the alternator. The alternator then outputs current to the battery. So then it flows through the connections on top of the battery and then back out while charging the battery at the same time. So, and this is the start point for the secondary wiring in the back of the truck to the Bluetti. Okay, so my alternator has a 135 amp max output. So this is the cable that I've connected to the battery terminal here that goes out down through the engine bay. It goes underneath the cab and then back up into the truck bed. So I've got it fused twice, once here and once in the truck bed. I'll explain why. So you always want a fuse close to the current source, because if you have an overcurrent situation and you don't have a fuse here, that whole wire becomes the fuse, and obviously the cable will melt and you'll have all kinds of problems. So you want to have a fuse at the beginning to protect the overall circuit, which is what this is. So at the beginning, so I have a 135 amp output on the alternator. So this fuse is rated at 130 amps. The wire that I've used is a 0 gauge. It is way overrated for what I'm currently using. The reason why I did this is because at some point I thought maybe I would upgrade to a high output alternator, which obviously will deliver much more current. And if I only install the wire gauge that supports what I have currently, if I upgraded, then I would need to upgrade all the wiring too. And I figured, well, I'll just get ahead of it. 0 gauge is still overrated, but when it comes to wiring, I like to go a little larger than needed, just because of safety and durability. If you have wire that is rated for the capacity that you are designing it for to carry, and you max it out, what'll happen is that wire will run warm, and which is not a bad thing, but I prefer to have a wire that will exceed that so it doesn't run warm, so everything runs smoothly. So off of the battery terminal, through the fuse, down to the engine, under the cab, and back to the truck bed. Okay, so here we are underneath, and you can see the cable that has come down. It's the big red one. I've got some split loom over the top of it and some sections to protect it from, rocks kicking up or something. And it's attached to the top edge of the chassis of the truck frame, and I don't have split loom on that part right there. So to secure it in place, I've got these stainless steel clamps that have the rubber, and because it's a box frame, getting a nut behind the bolt to tighten it on, well, that's just not really possible. So all I did, this is an aluminum frame, by the way, so I just drilled a hole, but I had these self-tapping bolts at the ready, so I drilled the appropriate size hole and then I just screwed it in. And when I first did it, I wasn't sure if it was going to stay tight, but they work perfectly. Okay, so coming back, you can see here, this cable is the ground cable. An aluminum frame, so cleared off some of the paint here, and I did the same thing here. I drilled a hole and I put this self-tapping screw in, and it is solid connection. So it was copper directly to aluminum, and it gives me a very solid ground. And then both cables, they go up, and you can see the mess that I made with the expanding foam. And right in here is there's a plastic knockout right there. The knockout is gone because when I was trying to cut a hole through it, it just sort of disintegrated. So I just fed the wires through and then filled it up with expanding foam from the inside, hence the mess. But it gives a nice watertight seal. Okay, so for those of you who have seen earlier videos, you know I have 200-watt solar panels bolted to the rack, and then I have the cabling coming down off the roof, down between the cab and the camper shell, and it goes down and it follows the cables coming in from the bottom. Okay, so here we are in the back of the truck, and this is where all the cables come in from the solar panel and from the battery in the engine. This right here, that's the fuse. That's the second fuse that I mentioned earlier. This is a 60 amp fuse. The reason why it's 60 amp here is because that's the one that's feeding the 700 watt inverter. So to calculate current, you divide the power, 700 watts, by the voltage. So let's call it a nominal 12 volts. The actual voltage coming from the alternator is 13.99. So when you divide that out, it comes out to something like just under 60 amps. I wanted to get a fuse that was just rated just below that, like a 55 amp, but I couldn't find one, so I just went with a 60 amp. It's just a 1 amp over the max draw, which should still be safe. In an overcurrent situation, the fuse would still go before any significant damage happened. So that's why I have a lower rate of fuse on this side. Okay, so out of that, there's the cable that comes in, the live cable, into the isolator. This is the isolator. So an isolator, it's basically a switch, an open and closed switch. An isolator, though, has circuitry in it that will monitor what the voltage is coming in. So the voltage output of the alternator is higher than the voltage output of the battery. What the isolator does, it sees that higher voltage, recognizes that the alternator is running, closes the switch, and lets current flow. The reason why you do this is because when the engine's off, you are connected to the starter battery. And if you're charging your batteries in the back off of the starter battery with the engine off, you'll just drain your starter battery and you'll be having problems. So the isolator prevents that from happening. And then out of the isolator, right here, and into the 700 watt inverter. This is the inverter. Okay, so we talked about the power coming into the inverter, and then I have this right here. That's the power brick that charges the Bluetti unit, and it's plugged into the 110 outlet of the inverter. Now the question is, why am I doing that? Oh, also, before I forget, down in there you'll see that's what the inputs are. Do you see that blue and black plug going in? That's the solar panels. So the solar panels are hooked up independently of the main charging unit. So if the engine's running and the sun's out, I'm getting charged from both at the same time. So I can get a maximum of 600 watts at any one time. 400 from when the engine's running to 200 plus the 200 from the solar panels. Okay, so back to the main charging unit. So the main way that this comes ready to charge is by plugging it into a wall outlet, which is that, and that's the power break for it, which goes straight in. So, question, why don't I just go DC to DC? Okay, so let's talk about that. Okay, so why don't I go straight DC to DC? Well, technically I am at the same time because the solar panels are DC. Also, the input after it comes out of the power brick is also DC. But the standard way we know how to, through van life and all the modifications we see on YouTube, we always see, oh, well, why not go DC to DC charger? Okay, so in the typical installation and in the typical battery setup, the batteries are 12 volt batteries. And the common one we all know about is the 12 volt 100 amp hour battery. Okay, and everyone talks about amp hours, you need more amp hours. This is not true. The only number that means anything, that has any worth, is the usable power output. This would be watt hours. You calculate watts by multiplying voltage and current, volts times amps. Okay, so you got a 100 amp hour battery, that's 12 volts, 12 times 100, 1200. But in the Bluetti AC200max, which is what this unit is, the battery is a 40 amp hour battery, but it's 52.8 volts, I think it is. So, like, wow, that's like crazy. No, it makes sense. It actually makes it easier to transform. So if we're going from 52.8 volts to 110 volts, it's easier to transform. The way transformation works, people talk about inverters. I have a bit of an issue with that terminology because it doesn't really mean anything. The inversion and inverter is two separate things. First off, it has to create a sine wave, an AC sine wave from a flat line, DC to AC. This is called rectification. And the other thing it has to do is change the voltage, right? So you got low voltage to high voltage. So that's called a step-up transformer. To do this, it goes in sections. There are windings, coils. So it'll take whatever voltage you start at, say 12 volts, and it'll say, depending on how they're constructed and how the coils are, it could go from like 12 to 24, and 24 to 48, 48 to 96. It just depends. Every transformer is different, but that's called a step-up transformer. So the lower the voltage to the higher the voltage, the more steps are required. In doing this, those coils get hot. This then in turn, that heat is the energy loss. When you talk about efficiency of an inverter, that's basically the most you get lost, because That current flowing will make those windings, the conductors, warm up. The current, not all the current can pass through, so energy converts into heat. The heat dissipates, you lose the energy. That's how that works. So the fewer steps between transformation, the more efficient it gets, the easier it becomes. So going from 52 volts to 110, that's a significant help. It's easier to do. And then if you got any, most of the outputs for DC are going to be USB ports. We're going to be 5 volts anyway, so you need a transformer. Even if it was a 12 volt battery, you still have to transform it down. That's easy. Transforming DC down to DC, very, very simple. Up is harder to do. So using a higher voltage battery is actually easier. And I suspect this is why Bluetti have done it. So in this case, so Bluetti says it's got a 2048 watt hour max output. So that's what that is. It's the voltage times the current, the amps. I had to think about that for a second. Yeah. So so the battery being a 40 amp hour battery and a 52.8. I think it's 52 points, 52 point something. You multiply those together and you get the 2048. That's what the battery output, the max battery output in power output, this can do. And that's the claim on the front. That's why it tells you you've got 2048. So the actual usable power, though, is calculated via the efficiency of the inverter. So through testing on the Bluetti, you get about an 82% efficiency. So it's somewhere around 1700 watts of usable output, which is very good. That's a high value. But like I said, it's easier to transform 52 volts into 110. I explained that. The reason why I explained that is why I have to go from my alternator to the 700 watt inverter, plug it in through the power brick and into charging up the Bluetti, because the battery charge voltage needs to be 58.8 volts. It always has to be a little higher than the battery voltage, just like the alternator in a car. The starter battery is just over 12 volts, 12.4, something like that. But the charging voltage is around 14 volts, right? The charging voltage is always a little higher. It makes it easier to charge because more current can flow, more power can flow. So that is why I had to do it this way, and I couldn't go straight DC to DC because that power brick has to transform the voltage to 58.8 volts to charge up the battery. So I can't use straight 13 volts. Oh, well, I can. So, Lewis, you asked the question, why can't I plug it straight into a lighter socket? The answer is, well, I can. But when you do that, there's very little power coming from it. It's low voltage to begin with. The MPPT charger inside, or any MPPT charger, cannot differentiate what you are connected to, whether you're connected to a battery, whether you're connected to a lighter socket. So it's when you transform electricity, it's a trade-off. Low voltage, higher current, and vice versa, right? So with a low voltage DC coming in, the MPPT charger is going to, by default, not pull a lot of current, because if you're plugging into a lighter socket and you start pulling a ton of current through that, it's gonna fry the wires, because those little wires are very, very small. They can't pull a lot of current, and you start a fire. So the charger can't go, oh, 12 volt input, let's just pull 400 watts. Well, you can't. It'll just fry the whole system. So you only get about 100 watts of charging out of a lighter socket. And yes, I can go DC to DC, but like I said, you get about 100 watts of charging out of it. Whereas with this coming out of the 110, it's a higher voltage. So now the charger can start pulling a lot more power. So I get a full 400 watts out of this because it's coming off of 110. Does that make sense? And not a lower voltage. And that's how they've designed the system, because it's got a higher voltage battery. If it were a 12-volt battery, yes, there's probably a way I can hook it up to DC directly and get good charging out of it. But honestly, I kind of prefer it this way. One of the advantages is because the inverter is hooked up independently, if for some reason the Bluetti fails and I still need some power, I can just plug into the inverter and run the engine, and I still got power. The inverter has a USB connection on it, so I can still charge things up. It's only 700 watts, but I can do something with 700 watts. I can cook at a low grade or something like that, boil a kettle or something like that. It's still usable independently of the Bluetti, so I still get something out of that. So I kind of like that. Now, to address a further point for the DC to DC and lighter circuit. So Bluetti has some accessories that you can buy to help charging. So one of those is this. Let me just pull it out real quick. They call this the DC charging enhancer. So this is a similar module to the main power brick, and it also plugs in to the same outlet, which is that. So when I learned about this unit, I'm like, ooh, maybe I can go DC to DC, because it tells you, hey, this will support 500 watts, which is what the main power brick also rates to. And I'm like, yes, okay, I can do away with the inverter, I can put this in its place, and I can hook this straight to the battery, and I tried it. It's the same as a lighter socket. That's all you get out of it. What it tells you, and you have to read it carefully, is that the input is 500 watt max, not the output. Although the output will too, but you have to have high voltage for it. So here, let's see. Hopefully that's focusing in on it. I don't know if you can read what it says on the back there, but it gives you the input and the output. If you look at the output, look at the range of voltages. So like I was saying, with electricity, it's a trade-off. It says, hey, yeah, you can do, well, and it says right there, DC output is 16 volts to 58.8 volts. So the 58.8 is what that requires to charge the battery. But if you have low voltage going in, if you hold one of these in your hand and compare it to that power brick, you will instantly see that this thing is pretty much just empty. It's just a box and it's really light, where that thing is a big old solid transformer. So this only gives you about 100 watts output from a 12 volt source, just like the lighter. Now it tells you in the information on the product that you can double it up and have 500 watts. Yes, but they're not clear on what that is. You have to have a high enough voltage going in. So what they're talking about is if you use this to hook up more solar panels, because you can hook up 700 watts of solar panels of solar power coming into this through the PV input. So with this, you can hook up another array of solar panels at the same value, I think, 500 watt max, and plug this into the main charging port, right? But you have to remember, the output voltage of solar panels is above 20 volts. This is the difference. There's an open circuit voltage. When you research your solar panels, if you're going to buy solar panels, look at the open circuit voltage. Most of them are somewhere in the region of 22 to 24 volts. And that is significant because you've got a higher voltage coming in, which means, as I said, is the ratio, right? So a high voltage and a higher current, you multiply those together, you get more power. Especially if you get solar panels and you hook them in series, and now you're doubling the voltage. So two 24 volt open circuit solar panels in series will give you 48 volts, right? Which means you're going to get a higher power output than a single, much higher than a single 12 volt source, right? Even though it's a 12 volt solar panel, it's not really. The MPPT charger will see the input voltage, which is the open circuit voltage of that solar panel. That's what you have to look at. So Lewis, I hope this answers your question. This is why, yes, you can hook it up to a lighter socket, two at the same time, actually, if you use one of these, but you're only going to get 100 watts a piece, and it will take forever to charge up. Whereas having 200 watts of solar, 400 watts coming in from the main charge pack, at the same time, I've got upwards of up to 600 watts coming in, which will charge up your batteries much, much faster than 100 watts. Now you can plug it into the lighter socket as well as the coming off the battery at the same time by using that PV port. So the PV input is universal for DC input, so you can hook it up to solar panels, you can hook it up to your lead acid battery, you can hook it up to, there's a multitude of ways you can hook it up, and that will run parallel to the main input from the charging brick. So those are emergency things. So that's why I bought this, and I believe currently, what's the model on this? It's the D050S. When I read about it, I'm like, oh my god, this is gonna be great. I can get away, I can stop using the inverter, and I can condense my wiring right there, but it doesn't give you what you think. So if you're looking to buy one of these and hook it up, research. Hopefully this video will help, but to get the max out of it, you gotta go the way I've got it done. Okay, I'm gonna close this video out right here, and I hope this was helpful.